World leaders and diplomats have gathered in New York for this year's United Nations General Assembly meeting. The UN was set up towards the end of World War II with the goal to maintain international peace and prevent another global conflict. But can this 1945 institution really solve 21st century problems? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, war, famine, genocide and climate change. The UN General Assembly meets this week against a backdrop of major problems facing humanity. But with so many conflicts and so much division around the world, is it still fit for purpose?
The members carry out the final business of the League, which now gives place to a more powerful organization. The League is dead. Long live the United Nations.
Founded in the aftermath of World War II, the United Nations is the bedrock of an international order that persists to this day. But with the world fracturing into blocs and more conflicts, that order is under threat. During the Cold War, it was a vital mechanism for the Western Alliance, Communist bloc and non-aligned countries to engage in dialogue. Its humanitarian aid agencies such as UNRWA, the body that supports millions of displaced Palestinians, have done vital work. Over the decades, its famous blue-helmeted peacekeepers have been involved in numerous missions. Some a relative success, like Liberia, but others, like the force sent to Cyprus in 1964, were ineffective. The 5 permanent members of the Security Council, Britain, France, China, America and the Soviet Union, now Russia, were given all-important vetoes based on being victors of a war that ended 80 years ago. Many regional powers have expressed frustration with this outdated system, most notably Turkey's leader Recep Tayyip Erdogan.
It is clear that unless the United Nations Security Council, the main body responsible for international peace and security, is reformed, these efforts cannot completely achieve its goal. That is why we remind the international community at every opportunity of the fact that the world is bigger than 5.
Her fırsatta uluslararası kamuoyuna hatırlatıyoruz.
With the humanitarian catastrophe caused by Israel's genocide in Gaza and a devastating Ukraine war with no end in sight, is the United Nations losing its relevance?
Well, let's meet our guests. In Ulaanbaatar, in Mongolia, we have Mukesh Kapila. Mukesh is a former United Nations advisor. In Istanbul, Matthew Bryza, a former American ambassador to Azerbaijan. In London, we're joined by Fawaz Gerges, who is Professor of International Relations at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And I'm delighted to say, here with me in the studio, we have Isabel Hilton, writer, broadcaster, and founder of the China Dialogue Trust. You're all very welcome to this roundtable. Mukesh, to you first. I want to begin with the words of Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the UN this week. He said, 80 years ago, from the ashes of war, the world planted a seed of hope. One charter, one vision, one promise, that peace is possible when humanity stands together. I think the problem we have is that humanity is very much not standing together in 2025.
Well, we should not be surprised. I think 80 years ago, the world was in a very, very different place. And it, from a few nations that made up the UN 80 years ago, we have a whole and diverse family of nations, of free nations all over the world. So the words of 80 years ago may have a resonance for the present, but I think looking back on the past, instead of on the present, in planning for the future, would be a mistake. We must look forward, not backwards. And Antonio Guterres' words are well taken, but quite honestly, they reflect a world that is dead and is no use crying over spilt milk.
Very good point. Matthew, just come in on that. Given everything we see in the world, so much conflict and famine and genocide and climate change, is the UN fit for purpose? This modern world with so many issues and so much political fragmentation, Is it fit for purpose?
Oh, no, it's definitely not fit for purpose, Edna. I mean, as we just heard, 1945 was a different world, and fresh from the calamity, basically, of two world wars and the use of nuclear weapons, et cetera, there was a certain level of shock in the international community that led to some degree of consensus that we really needed to come together and try to, well, avoid wars and avoid conflicts. But, without an enforcement mechanism or a military force of any sort, or with a Security Council such as it is, and I'm sure we'll talk about this in greater detail, but where there's a veto, that any of 5 countries that were maybe all great powers back in 1945, but maybe no longer are, leads to ineffectiveness of the entire UN body. I'm not talking, of course, about the General Assembly in this case, but the entire body. And, here in Turkey, I mean, President Erdogan's slogan for years has been the world is bigger than 5, meaning there needs to be a reform of the Security Council so it's more democratic and more representative. And the fact that countries not only like Turkey, but Germany, India, Japan, Brazil don't have a chance to be permanent members, whereas other countries that are constantly exercising their veto power to prevent consensus or action on issues such as Ukraine or Syria or Israel, Gaza, is an enormous shortcoming that undermines the United Nations' effectiveness.
Thank you, Matthew. Fawaz, to you, how much of a problem then is it that the so-called Big Five, the permanent 5, you've got the US, UK, China, Russia, France, that they have a veto? How much of an issue do you think in the modern world that those 5 countries get to call the shots?
Well, I mean, it has been a major challenge since the end of World War II, because both the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War basically neutralized the Security Council as a result of the global rivalry. I think what we are seeing today, and I don't exaggerate, this is the most dangerous moment in world history since the end of 1945. Why? Because the norms and the rules that used to govern the international system have been ruptured, have been shredded to a million pieces. There are very few rail guards. There are very few firefighters. And in particular, if you ask me, that the United States has forfeited its leadership. Think of what the United States has been doing in the past a few months. Think of how many vetoes it used, in the Security Council when it comes to the unfolding genocide in Gaza. Just a few days ago, the United States refused to give visas to the political leadership, the Palestinian leadership, to attend the United Nations, even though there is no alternative to Hamas except the Palestinian leadership led by Mohammed Abbas, regardless of what you think of it. And secondly, think of what the United States have been doing, not just in the United Nations and the Security Council. The United States now imposed sanctions on the judges of the International Criminal Court and threatened to impose sanctions on the judges of the International Court of Justice. This is the United States today. The United States is it. Of course, Russia's invasion of the Ukraine was a catalyst for also neutralizing and marginalizing the United Nations and the Security Council. But both the Israeli war and what the US has been doing is pivotal in understanding why we are at this particular moment, the most dangerous moment in world history, because the world is changing, yet the structure of the system does not really keep up with the changes that are taking place in the international system.
Thank you, Fawaz. Isabel, to you, that point Fawaz made, the most dangerous moment in world history since 1945. I mean, that's a big statement to make. Do you agree?
I find it hard to disagree with it, frankly. And on the question of what role history has in this discussion, I think sometimes we do need to look back in order to look forward. It took a global catastrophe and millions of dead to give us the United Nations. And, in the old English saying, always keep a hold of nurse for fear of finding something worse, I think we should be very careful before we pronounce it dead. Think of the counterfactual. You know, what is the Global Forum without the United Nations? It's as effective as its members allow it to be. And right now, as we've heard, and I don't disagree with what's been said, its members are behaving extraordinarily badly. But one of the ways in which we understand that bad behavior is through the behavior at the United Nations. And if we write off the United Nations at this point, I'm sorry, we are facing an extraordinarily dangerous world and destroying the mechanisms that still remain, inadequate as they are, to reproach, to regulate, to scrutinize, to alleviate, all those things in which, you know, in which everyone has a voice, in the General Assembly, for example.
Thank you, Isabel. Mukesh, this will be an historic week with several countries now recognising Palestinian statehood. France, Canada, Australia, the United Kingdom, all changing their stance given the genocide in Gaza. And yet nothing much will change for the Palestinian people because of that veto that certain countries have. How significant a moment do you think this is for the Palestinian people?
I think it might be a psychologically significant moment, but beyond that, it's purely symbolic. And I do not think the UN General Assembly, which is a collection of political actors, each with their own national axe to grind, whether large or small countries, and some of them millions of miles away from Gaza, don't care a hoot about what is happening in the Gaza. So I think what the US is doing is terrible, but don't let the other countries and powers get away from it. And I think, and forget about UN Security Council reform, that's a debate that is a completely wasted debate.
Thanks, Mukesh. I want to bring in Fawaz. Fawaz just has a point to make. Fawaz, come in there.
You know, we have to be direct and we have to be critical when we talk about the role of the United States. I am talking as an American now. The United States built the rules and the norms of the international system after 1945 and was and has been the main beneficiary of its dominant and hegemony in the international system. The reason why this particular moment is dangerous, when the United States misbehaves, the world knows that they could misbehave as well. It's not about blaming the United States, but when the United Nations says that Israel found that Israel carried a genocide, my question is, could Israel have carried out a genocide without American ammunition and arms and shielding Israel in the United Nations and the Security Council? That the United States is not only complicit in Israel genocide, the United States has played a major role, again, together with Germany and the United Kingdom to a smaller extent. And the world looks to the United States because the United States, regardless of what you think of it, is the most powerful nation. Its actions, that the fact is no longer respects international norms and rules, that the fact that the United States declared all-out war against, terror after 2001, the fact that the United States basically does whatever it wants, send the same lessons to Russia. Russia's invasion of the Ukraine was a template of what the United States did in Iraq in 2003. So the reason why I hold the United States responsible, it's the most powerful nation. It's the nation that set up the rules of the international system. It's a nation now that basically supports directly and indirectly genocide in Gaza. And it's a state that is telling the world now that the rules no longer applies. The United States could do whatever it wants.
Thanks, Fawaz. I just want to bring Matthew back in. Matthew, given all the problems that we're seeing and hearing about, if you were to maybe make one change in terms of reforming the UN, what would it be?
Well, I mean, for sure, I'm sorry, I can think of three. I mean, one, an enforcement mechanism, as we already heard. Two, the Security Council reform, which is never going to happen because the permanent five are never going to relinquish their inordinate power. But maybe for the General Assembly, maybe more focus. There's so many important issues on the agenda, but I know in the past year or so, there were something like 350 resolutions in the General Assembly that were debated and passed. And it's simply impossible for any mission to the United Nations really to know what those are all about and to figure out what the priorities are and then to follow up and ensure implementation.
Matthew, can I just make the point as well that for all its faults, the United Nations, we've not ended up in a third world war. I mean, 1945, the world was in a terrible place. So for all the division and all the questions about fit for purpose in the modern age, it has, on the face of it, been a success.
Oh, it has been. I mean, it has done some great things, right? I mean, in terms of humanitarian relief, I mean, Gaza is a different story because of what Fawaz was discussing, but humanitarian relief and fighting disease and fighting hunger, even some peacekeeping operations. Some have been terrible failures, like in Bosnia or in Somalia, but in Namibia and El Salvador, Mozambique, Sierra Leone, Liberia, UN peacekeeping operations really helped to ease those countries away from armed conflict, and in some cases toward democratic elections. So absolutely, thank goodness the UN exists, warts and all. There's a lot of change that needs to happen. Reform is very difficult, but the world would be a much less safe and a much less prosperous and a much less healthy place without it.
Thank you, Matthew. Isabel, you've done a huge amount of work on China, and you know the country and its mechanisms and its politics inside out. We've not mentioned China yet, but member of the Permanent Security Council. What's their contribution to the UN, and what do they get out of it?
Well, they get quite a lot out of it. They have a lot of influence in the General Assembly. They're big contributors to peacekeeping. It allowed their armed forces, which had no experience of serving abroad, to learn what that was like in all sorts of with all sorts of advantages. But I think in the longer term, witnessing as we are the very dubious state of the United States, that China sees an opportunity to mold the United Nations as an instrument of its own version of multilateralism. And that means neutralizing things like universal human rights, but not neutralizing the United Nations altogether. So if you are looking at the things that I think 20 years ago we might have assumed would be basic tasks of the UN, we're entering an age of new technologies. Who's going to regulate those? How can we achieve universal standards, universal norms for the use of those technologies? You get back to the UN, and I think we will see those things coming back into the UN, but led by China rather than the United States.
And
so
tell me, Isabel,
China has a lot to play for here.
The 5 members of the Permanent Security Council, the so-called Big Five, 4 of them have serious problems. France is skint, Russia's at war with Ukraine, the United Kingdom flatlining along, the United States, all sorts of political divide and division and everything we're seeing play out, political assassinations. The only one of the Permanent 5 that seems to be in a really good place is China.
You can overstate that. China depends on global markets. It depends. It's got terrible deflation at the moment. Those great companies that we admire and which are fantastic, they're all losing money because they're in a kind of absolutely cutthroat competition with themselves, and their only exit is through exports, and the international reception for Chinese technologies is becoming more difficult, not just in the European Union or the United States, but also in lots of intermediate economies which have industrial sectors of their own. So, China is, trying to negotiate its way through the middle income trap. It's trying to come to terms with its responsibilities as a global power. It's got complications with North Korea. It's got this partnership with Russia, which is a double-edged sword. And it's got a very uncertain economy at home, an aging population, and so on. So it, too, has its problems.
Thank you, Isabel. Mukesh, back to you. It's clear bold political leadership is needed globally. Where do you think it's going to come from in terms of the UN and its future?
I disagree with so much of this debate in terms of the framing that you're making of it. But leaving that aside, to answer your question, why do you think the leadership should come from one country or another country? And I do not agree that the United States is that powerful. In fact, it's a mindset of non-Americans that are giving the Americans a lot of power. Power is distributed nowadays. And today it is not physical power, not even economic power. It's all the other influences that are taking place that are important. And we do not need the United Nations to set global norms anymore. The world has changed in 80 years. And today, norms on many issues, health, education, transport, climate change, environment, and many, many other topics I deal with every day, they're made in specialized fora in many, many different places. And finally, let me make the point why we do not need the United Nations as a universal organization in that uncritical way that this debate is framing it. You know, when you have a headache, you don't go to the neurosurgeon for that. You try and solve your headache at the nearest point to where the head is. Similarly, the UN is failing because we're taking all the problems and making them universal. And those problems should be solved locally, regionally, nationally. And yet we're trying to take everything to the United Nations and thinking that the world doctor is going to cure all our aches and pains. I'm afraid we have to revisit this whole paradigm of universalization of our international cooperation. And the UN is one part of it, but it is by no means the most important. Other regional organizations and other global entities are equally or even so more important.
Mukesh, I'm curious, what did you not agree with? What was the main problem you had with the conversation?
Well, I think the conversation I have is that it is very US-centric and it's very UN institutionally centric. I mean, the point is everywhere, and I travel the world a lot in all sorts of countries, people are taking power into their hands. The internet standards are not being set by the UN. The artificial intelligence standards might be dominated by American companies, but they're not being set by the UN. The pharmaceutical standards in terms of the latest technologies, and I'm a doctor by profession, they are not being set by the World Health Organization, where I worked also for some years. My whole point is that there is a diversity and a distribution of influence and power. And that needs to be reflected in modern architecture. Who cares what the General Assembly thinks? Who cares what the Security Council thinks? We have the BRICS, we have the regional organizations. World Trade Organization is already moribund, but we have many trade blocs and trading regions.
Mukesh, you make some great points. I want to bring Matthew in, and I can see Fawaz wants to speak as well. Matthew, to you first, briefly.
Sure. I think what I was saying a few moments ago about one of the reforms I predicted is part of Mukesh's argument. There's too much on the General Assembly's agenda. Too many resolutions, too many topics, impossible for any mission to the UN to follow, much less getting views back from the Capitol. It's become more of a debating society to score points. But I agree with Mukesh. If we're relying on the General Assembly or the UN in its entirety to resolve these problems, of course they're not going to be resolved.
Fawaz, just come in as well.
Well, first of all, the challenge that we are facing today is that the world has really changed. The world is no longer really, power does not really reside in Washington or London and Paris, but the international institutions that were set up after 1945 have not changed. The Security Council, the World Bank, the IMF. This is what I'm talking about, is that, and that's why change is needed. It's not just about reform. When we talk about world institutions, they matter. My colleagues talks about diversity. How does the Global South, many of the poor nations, deal with the World Bank and the IMF and the Security Council, where the 5 members basically use vetoes whatever they want? I need 2 things. I would like to see 2 things. And by the way, I'm a great fan of the United Nations. I have nothing but the deepest respect for the great humanitarian work that the United Nations and its agencies are doing all over the world, in particular in Gaza and Africa, the UN peacekeeping forces worldwide. I need 2 things. The first thing, forget the traditional notions of the Global South and the West. I want to really see a rainbow coalition of Global South nation, progressive nations, and Western nations. Ireland, Spain, Norway, Belgium, and this rainbow coalition of progressive state could really make a huge difference and try to really push, the United States and the 5 members, Russia and China, to really change the structure of the international system. And I think finally, I know this is a big one, I really like to see the United Nations move out of New York to a neutral nation like Norway. Norway would be really an ideal place, or South Africa, because I think the world has changed, but power continues to reside in certain institutions that basically are blocking real change, because the world is really very hungry for change. And given the moment we are in, global institutions, universal institutions have never been as important as they are today.
Thank you, Fawaz. That is a fascinating point. Should it move out of New York? Norway, perfect. What do you think?
Well, I think that would be almost as difficult as getting the Security Council to resolve itself. But I did want to come back on the notion that it is all obsolete. And yes, I agree. Too many things go to the UN. I agree that the UN is not going to solve even the global problems that we want it to solve. However, insufficient as it is, it remains necessary. And I think that triage of what it can do and what it can't do is really important. And I'll take climate as an example. I don't think we're going to resolve climate change entirely through the UN. But without Rio 1992, without the UNFCCC, without the focus on science, none of the other things would be happening. The coalitions of the willing, the kind of advances in technology, were all made possible by the framework that was set up and which, you know, continues to grind on, sometimes frustratingly. But it has enabled all the other things to happen. And I think that's what we'd lose.
Did Mukesh have a point when he said you don't go to a neurosurgeon with a headache?
Sure, that's the coalitions of the willing, that's the regional trade organizations, absolutely. Don't go, you know, don't ask an elephant to, you know, embroider a piece of cloth. But, you know, there are things you need the elephant for.
And Isabel, it's not perfect. Clearly, it's not perfect, but it's the best we have.
Absolutely.
And we have to keep working with it.
Imagine trying to recreate anything remotely like it in this world. Impossible. Don't lose it until you have something better.
Isabel, thank you. Matthew, Fawaz and Mukesh in Mongolia, thank you all so much. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me, Enda Brady, and all the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.